17th tribe, the Khazar Empire and its heritage.
It was a momentous triumph of Byzantine diplomacy. Vernadsky calls it one of those abrupt turns which make the study of history so fascinating, and it is interesting to speculate on the possible course of history had the Russian princess adopted either of these faiths, Judaism or Islam, instead of Christianity. The acceptance of one or another of these faiths must necessarily have determined the future cultural and political development of Russia. The acceptance of Islam would have drawn Russia into the circle of Arabian culture, that is, an Asiatic Egyptian culture. The acceptance of Roman Christianity from the Germans would have made Russia a country of Latin or European culture. The acceptance of either Judaism or Orthodox Christianity ensured to Russia cultural independence of both Europe and Asia. But the Russians needed allies more than they needed independence, and the East Roman Empire, however corrupt, was still a more desirable ally in terms of power, culture, and trade than the crumbling empire of the Khazars. Nor should one underestimate the role played by Byzantine statesmanship in bringing about the decision for which it had worked for more than a century. The Russian Chronicles' naive account of Vladimir's game of procrastination gives us no insight into the diplomatic maneuverings and hard bargaining that must have gone on before he accepted baptism, and thereby, in fact, Byzantine tutelage for himself and his people. Cherson was obviously part of the price, and so was the dynastic marriage to Princess Anna. But the most important part of the deal was the end of the Byzantine-Khazar alliance against the Rus, and its replacement by the Byzantine-Russian alliance against the Khazars. A few years later, in 1016, a combined Byzantine-Russian army invaded Khazaria, defeated its ruler, and subdued the country. Yet the cooling off towards the Khazars had already started, as we have seen in Constantine's Porphyrogentius' day, 50 years before Vladimir's conversion. We remember Constantine's muses on how war is to be made on Khazaria and by whom. The passage quoted earlier on continues. If the ruler of Alania does not keep the peace with the Khazars, but considers the friendship of the emperor of the Romans to be of greater value to him, then, if the Khazars do not choose to maintain friendship and peace with the emperor, the Alan can do them great harm. He can ambush their roads and attack them when they are off their guard on their route to Sarkel and to the 9 regions and to Cherson. Black Bulgaria, the Volga Bulgars, is also in a position to make war on the Khazars. Tonaby, after quoting this passage, makes the following rather touching comment. If this passage in Constantine Porphyrogentius' manual for the conduct of the East Roman imperial government's foreign relations had ever fallen into the hands of the Khazar Khakan and his ministers, they would have been indignant. They would have pointed out that nowadays Khazaria was one of the most pacific states in the world, and that if she had been more warlike in her earlier days, her arms had never been directed against the East Roman Empire. The two powers had, in fact, never been at war with each other, while, on the other hand, Khazaria had frequently been at war with the East Roman Empire's enemies, and this to the Empire's signal advantage. Indeed, the Empire may have owed it to the Khazars that she had survived the successive onslaughts of the Sassanid Persian Emperor Khusraw II, Parviz, and the Muslim Arabs. And after the pressure on the empire of the Arabs' onslaught had been relieved by the vigor of the Khazars' offensive-defensive resistance to the Arabs' advance towards the Caucasus, the friendship between Khazaria and the empire had been symbolized and sealed in two marriage alliances between their respective imperial families. What, then, had been in Constantine's mind when he had been thinking out ways of tormenting Khazaria by inducing her neighbors to fall upon her? The answer to Tonabi's rhetorical question is obviously that the Byzantines were inspired by realpolitik, and that, as already said, theirs was not a sentimental age, nor is ours. Nevertheless, it turned out to be a short-sighted policy. To quote Bury once more, the first principle of imperial policy in this quarter of the world was a maintenance of peace with the Khazars. This was the immediate consequence of the geographical position of the Khazar Empire, lying as it did between the Dnieper and the Caucasus. From the 7th century, when Heraclius had sought the help of the Khazars against Persia, to the 10th, in which the power of Attila declined. This was the constant policy of the emperors. It was to the advantage of the empire that the Chagan should exercise an effective control over his barbarous neighbors. This effective control was now to be transferred from the Khazar Kagan to the Rus Kagan, the Prince of Kiev. But it did not work. The Khazars were a Turkish tribe of the steppes, who had been able to cope with wave after wave of Turkish and Arab invaders. They had resisted and subdued the Bulgars, Burtas, Pechengins, Guz, and so on. The Russians and the Slavs subjects were no match for the nomad warriors of the steppes, their mobile strategy and guerrilla tactics. As a result of the constant nomad pressure, the centuries of Russian power were gradually transferred from the southern steppes to the wooded north to the principalities of Galicia, Novgorod, and Moscow. The Byzantines had calculated that Kiev would take over the role of Attila as the guardian of Eastern Europe and century of trade. Instead, Kiev went into rapid decline. It was the end of the first chapter of Russian history, followed by a period of chaos, with a dozen independent principalities waging endless wars against each other. This created a power vacuum into which poured a new wave of conquering nomads, or rather, a new offshoot of our old friends, the Gus, whom Ibn Fadlan had found even more abhorrent than the other barbarian tribes which he was obliged to visit. These pagan and godless foes, as the chronicle describes them, were called Polovesti by the Russians, Cumans by the Byzantines, Kun by the Hungarians, Kipchaks by their fellow Turks. They ruled the steppes as far as Hungary from the late 11th to the 13th century, when they, in turn, were swamped by the Mughal invasion. They also fought several wars against the Byzantines. Another branch of the Gus, the Seljuks, named after their ruling dynasty, destroyed a huge Byzantine army in the historic Battle of Manzikert. This occurred in 1071. And captured the Emperor Romanius IV Diogenes. Henceforth, the Byzantines were unable to prevent the Turks from gaining control of most provinces of Asia Minor, the present-day Turkey, which had previously been the heartland of the East Roman Empire. One can only speculate whether history would have taken a different course if Byzantium had not abandoned its traditional policy, maintained throughout the 3 previous centuries, of relying on the Khazar stronghold against the Muslims, Turkish, and Viking invaders.
B.
That as it may, imperial realpolitik turned out to have been not very realistic. During the 2 centuries of Kuman rule, followed by the Mongol invasion, the eastern steppes were once more plunged into the Dark Ages, and the later history of the Khazars is shrouded in even deeper obscurity than their origin. The references to the Khazar state in its final period of decline are found mainly in Muslim sources, but they are, as we shall see, so ambiguous that almost every name, date, and geographical indication is open to several interpretations. Historians, famished for facts, have nothing left but a few bleached bones to gnaw at like starving bloodhounds, in the forlorn hope of finding some hidden morsel to sustain them. In the light of what has been said before, it appears that the decisive event precipitating the decline of Khazar power was not Sviatosla's victory, but Vladimir's conversion. How important was, in fact, that victory, which 19th century historians habitually equate with the end of the Khazar state? We remember that the Russian chronicle mentions only the destruction of Sarkel, the fortress, but not the destruction of Atil, the capital. That Atil was indeed sacked and devastated we know from several Arab sources, which are too insistent to be ignored. But when and by whom it was sacked is by no means clear. Ibn Hakal, the principal source, says it was done by the Rus, who utterly destroyed Khazarian. Samandar, and Itil, apparently believing that Kazarian and Itil were different towns, whereas we know that they were one twin town. And his dating of the event differs from the Russian Chronicles dating of the fall of Sarkel, which Ibn Hakel does not mention at all, just as the Chronicle does not mention the destruction of Itil. Accordingly, Marquardt suggests that Itil was sacked not by Slatozva's Rus, who only got as far as Sarkel, but by some fresh wave of Vikings. To complicate matters a little more, the second Arab source, Ibn Miskawayh, says that it was a body of Turks which descended on Khazaria in the critical year 965. By Turks, he may have meant the Rus, as Barthold maintained, but it could also have been a meandering horde of Pichengians, for instance. It seems that we shall never know who destroyed Itil, however long we chew the bones. And how seriously was it destroyed? The principal source, Ibn Hakel, first speaks of the utter destruction of Itil, but then he also says, writing a few years later, that Kazarian is still the center on which the Rus trade converges. Thus, the phrase utter destruction may have been an exaggeration. This is more likely because he also speaks of the utter destruction of the town of Bulgar, capital of the Volga Bulgars. Yet the damage which the Rus caused in Bulgar could not have been too important, as we have coins that were minted there in the year 976 through 7. Only about 10 years after Slatozva's raid. And in the 13th century, Bulgar was still an important city. As Dunlop puts it, the ultimate source of all statements that the Russians destroyed Khazaria in the 10th century is no doubt Ibn Hakel. Ibn Hakel, however, speaks as positively of the destruction of Bulgar on the Middle Volga. It is quite certain that at the time of the Mongol attacks in the 13th century, Bulgar was a flourishing community. Was the ruin of Khazaria also temporary? It obviously was. Khazarian, Itil, and the other towns of the Khazars consisted mostly of tents, wooden dwellings, and round houses built of mud, which were easily destroyed and easily rebuilt. Only the royal and public buildings were of brick. The damage done must nevertheless have been serious, for several Arab chroniclers speak of a temporary exodus of the population to the Caspian shore or islands. Thus, Ibn Hakel says the Khazars of Itil fled from the Rus to one of the islands of the Naphtha coast, Baku, but later returned to Itil and Khazarian with the aid of the Muslim Shah of Shirwan. This sounds plausible since the people of Shirwan had no love for the Rus, who had plundered their shores earlier on. Other Arab chroniclers, Ibn Miskawa and Muqaddasi, writing later than Ibn Hakal, also speaks of an exodus of Khazars and their return with Muslim help. According to Ibn Miskawa, as a price for this help, they all adopted Islam with the exception of their king. Muqaddasi has a different version, which does not refer to the Rus invasion. He only says that the inhabitants of the Khazar town went down to the sea and came back converted to Islam. The degree of his reliability is indicated by the fact that he describes Bulgar as being closer to the Caspian than its hill, which amounts to placing Glasgow south of London. In spite of the confused and biased nature of these accounts, which seems all too obvious, there is probably some truth in them. The psychological shock of the invasion, the flights to the sea, and the necessity of buying Muslim help may have led to some deal which gave the Muslim community in Khazaria a greater say in the affairs of state. We remember a similar deal with Marwan 2 centuries earlier, which involved the Kagan himself, but left no mark on Khazar history. According to yet another Arab source, Biruni, who died in 1048, Atil, in time, was in ruins. Or rather, once more in ruins. It was rebuilt again, but henceforth it went under the name of Saksin. It figures repeatedly in the chronicles well into the 12th century as a large town on the Volga, surpassed by none in Turkestan, and eventually, according to one source, became the victim of inundations. Another century later, the Mongol ruler Batu built his capital on its site. In summing up what the Russian Chronicle and the Arab sources tell us about the catastrophe of 965, we can say that Atil was devastated to an unknown extent by the Rus or some other invaders, but rebuilt more than once, and that the Khazar state emerged from the ordeal considerably weakened. But there can be little doubt that inside its shrunken frontiers it survived for at least another 200 years, to the middle of the 12th century, and perhaps, though more doubtfully, until the middle of the 13th.
Next, the conclusion of the Khazar fall.